welcome everyone to this first in a series of discussions that we're organizing as part of the outreach of our research project called Pushing the Boundaries, which is hosted at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Vienna and funded by the John Templeton Foundation. It is our great pleasure to have Hasok Chang here as our first guest today. We will give an introduction to Hasok shortly. First, I just wanted to say a few general things about who we are and what this whole series is supposed to be about. So we, the panel, are the members of the project. The project is co-led by me and Tarja Knuuttila, who's on a train right now, so she won't be visually present, but may post some questions in the chat. Andrea Loettgers, who is dialing in from California today, so very early in the morning there, and our two PhD students on the project, Kevin Purkhauser and Poledna. Our project is called Pushing the Boundaries because we're trying to use a very formal approach to understand life, the organization of life, how it differs from non-living systems, how that matters for discussions about evolution, AI, and other things. And the idea is not to show that everything is formalizable, but exactly to show that formalization is eventually limited, that we will push the boundaries, but not get rid of the boundaries of what we can model formally in living systems. And it's a project that spans philosophy, biology, physics. And in that context, we have been doing a reading group together for the last 2 years, and we've been reading the work from a lot of really interesting people. And among those was Hasok's book, Realism for Realistic People, which we will be discussing today. So the idea is to have a series of public chats that will be recorded now, where we will be addressing these authors that we really like, and we'll be talking about their work, hopefully a little bit in the context of how it is important to our interdisciplinary project and how we're using that work. The idea is to have a quick intro by the guest. Hasok will give a 10 to 15-minute introduction, and then we will have a discussion within the panel with Hasok until the hour completes, and then we will open up the discussion to everyone. The whole thing shouldn't be taking more than 90 minutes, but if we're really excited and there's a really interesting discussion at the 90 minutes mark, we can maybe go a little bit over time, depending on whether Hasok has more time or not. And as I said before, please keep your screens off for the first, in the audience for the first hour of the panel discussion. Afterwards, we can switch everybody on. That's just for the visuals of the recording. Once more, for those who have joined late, if you don't want to be seen, this is going to go up on YouTube. Do keep your camera switched off. You have the possibility to put your questions in the chat, and you don't have to show your face on here. Just very briefly, and it shouldn't be necessary to say this, but this is a very interdisciplinary event. So during the discussion, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand, or as I said, you can type it in the chat. If you have a follow-up question, maybe type a message about that in the chat so we can bump you up in the question queue. Please refrain from discussing very detailed technical topics because we have people from all over that are joining here. The idea is to have a big picture here of Hasok's work. And I shouldn't say, but you know, we're going to stay civil and attack the argument and not the person, of course. So we'll try to avoid jargon. One of the beautiful things about Hasok's book is, and I will say that to the non-philosophers in the room, it is really, really readable, and you should read it because it's not only readable, but it's also very good and interesting. So it's one of those philosophy books that really everybody can read, and we highly recommend it. But before I actually give the introduction to Hasok, I will pass on to Andrea, who will introduce Hasok today.
So good morning. So I only will not take much from our valuable discussion time because I think we all want to talk to, want to hear to Hasok and to the discussion. So I think most of you already are familiar with Hasok and his important work, and in all these, his great list of publications, awards, and where is he member on which boards and so on. I don't want to go into this because, as I said, I don't want to take up too much of our time. And also, I won't not tell you, how much, but he did personally inspired me to do the kind of philosophy which I'm doing now. And I have to say thank you, Hasok. This was a great pleasure. So just briefly, Hasok is the Hans Rausing Professor of History and Philosophy of Science and the head of the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University in Cambridge. And I think he's widely known for two of his major books. The one it's called Is Water H2? The other one is Inventing Temperature and Measurement in Scientific Progress. So this is also two other books by Hasok, which I think we can really recommend reading. So for me, Hasok has been a driving force in introducing and establishing the philosophy of scientific practice, and which I really like working closely on and with historical cases, and in this framework developing his pragmatic approach to the philosophy. So his new book, which we are going to discuss today, is different in that it is written for a broader audience and also focuses more on philosophy itself. So there are case studies in there which really bring out the main point he wants to make, but it's a philosophy book. And I think it's the first time that you have been writing such a book purely on philosophy. So in Realism and Realistic People, Hasok takes us, I think, on a journey that challenges our understanding of basic concepts in philosophy of science or in philosophy in general, which means on the concept of truth and realism. And he introduces this from an activist perspective. And I think what it makes clear and shows is that, science, after all, is deeply rooted in scientific activities and in the pursuit of knowledge. And that we have to take this kind of practice, the scientific practice, seriously in understanding of how we are gaining knowledge in science and in the scientific process. So without further ado, I would like now to open the discussion and move on.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you, Johannes, for inviting me and for the very kind introduction. So I also don't want to take up too much of valuable discussion time. I'll try to be brief in my opening introduction. And what I'm most interested in doing today is hearing what you made of this book and answering any questions you might have. But because Andrea did ask me to just give a very general introduction, I thought I'd at least say what I want to know from you. So the first thing I'm curious to know is, when you read it, for those of you who have read it, is the aim of the book clear? And the way I've summarized it in one line is that I'm trying to advance new pragmatist conceptions of knowledge, truth, and reality. And I mean, that's a huge aim, which I can only hope to have started to achieve in this book. But I'll be curious to know, first of all, whether it was clear to you what I'm trying to do. And if it was clear, then you might have had this follow-up question. Well, why should anybody want to do that? Why try to craft pragmatist conceptions of these basic philosophical notions? And I'm curious to know whether you could see why I was doing that. And I mean, there are two things I want to say as a follow-up to that. One is, well, we don't very often question why we do philosophy, because we're too busy doing it. In that regard, philosophers are like any other professional groups, I guess. But if you wondered, why should anyone want to do this weird kind of philosophy as seen in this book, I would invite you to ask, why should anyone do the normal kind of philosophy of science, as it is known, at least in the Anglophone, analytically oriented world? I mean, what good is that kind of philosophy that you normally see, which, if it's epistemology, starts by putting up this idea, knowledge is justified through belief, and then you spend the rest of the time trying to knock that down or refine it by slightly altering one or another of the premises. What are we trying to achieve by doing that kind of philosophy? And I would ask you to set that question next to asking why I'm doing this strange thing. And I thought I should tell you just a couple of things about how this book came to be. So, what I'm trying to do is craft philosophical tools. So I'm thinking of philosophical concepts and ideas as tools for reaching better understanding of practices, both scientific practices and other kinds of practices in life. And the way this whole book came to be written is actually kind of curious. So Andrea mentioned already that my previous books had been this integrated mix of history and philosophy. History of science and philosophy of science, to be more precise. And that's how this book began as well. A few of you in the audience know that story already. I was writing another kind of book like that, I thought. And this time, the historical topic was the development of batteries and the scientific work surrounding the invention and use of batteries throughout the 19th century. So I started writing that history, and as with my previous books, I imagined there'll be also some philosophical ideas developed in conjunction with that historical work. And what I was developing was a kind of pragmatism, because in trying to understand the growth of knowledge in that history of batteries and their applications, I got stuck in trying to think of it in the usual philosophical terms concerning knowledge. So, I mean, picture the beginning of this story that I'm trying to tell, which is that Alessandro Volta invents the battery, the first battery, the so-called voltaic pile, which is a piled up assembly of two different pieces of two different metals and some wet stuff, paper or cloth soaked in water, salt water, some other electrolyte. So he makes this contraption and starts doing things, right? First, he made well, the initial things he did was just to apply that instrument to himself, giving himself electric shocks and flashes of light and strange taste that he experienced, and just pain in his skin and so on. And then the next thing that happens, people start building electric circuits, and then Ørsted discovers the electromagnetic effect, and Faraday does his work on electromagnetism, and everything goes from there, basically founding the modern technological civilization as we know it. So all of that happens, and there's clearly a great deal of growth of knowledge happening in that history. But how do we conceptualize this? What is the knowledge that came, as Volta invented the battery and started using it and improving it. And I just realized it's so difficult to capture that in terms of, what I critiqued in the book as the propositional conception of knowledge. Knowledge as these statements that are shown to be true. No, that's just so inadequate to capture the kind of knowledge that grows, especially in experimental science. And I started thinking more in terms of knowing how to do things, right? So this goes partly back to Gilbert Ryle's conceptions of knowing how and knowing that, but it's bigger than that. So anyway, that was the origin of how I started thinking about all this. And what happened is the philosophical part became so big and unwieldy, I had to let it have a life of its own rather than being stuck at the back of this book about the history of batteries. So this book became its own thing, came out 2 years ago, and that original book about the history of batteries is still not done. It's in third draft. I'm hoping to finish that up next summer. Anyway, so that's the spirit in which this book was written, and the key concepts that you see in it just arose in quite natural ways as I was trying to develop the ways of understanding what it is to know how to do all the things that we do in science, which ranges from the inventions of material instruments like I was talking about to the creation of theories and the solving of equations, the invention of the mathematics required to do all of that kind of theoretical work and everything in between. So this is how I crafted this notion of what I call active knowledge, right, which comes down to knowing how to do things. And in the analysis of these practices of knowledge, which I call epistemic practices, the key concept was operational coherence, as I called it, right? When we are trying to judge the quality of practices, when we're trying to judge, the quality of a proposition, it's easy to ask, is it true or not true? Or is it probable, whatever. But if we are asking, how good is this practice that these people are engaging in? How do we judge that? Well, by what criterion? And this notion of operational coherence is what I came up with in trying to grapple with that. And then I ended up using that notion of operational coherence to ground a revitalized pragmatist notion of truth as well as reality. And we can go into all of that as you like. And the book ends by a statement of what I call activist realism, right? Instead of the kind of scientific realism which says, oh, our best scientific theories are really true, how wonderful is that? The kind of realism I'm pushing is a commitment to do whatever it takes to learn the most about nature that we can. And from that perspective, we can make unlikely allies, starting with Popper and Kuhn. In their own way, they were both advocating for the maximally effective ways of learning. And in my rendition, this activist realism naturally ends up in pluralism, because we're saying we're not going to prejudge which direction of investigation will bring us the best knowledge. No, we're going to try all sorts of different ways. We're going to engage in different kinds of epistemic activities, and we will learn most likely from each avenue of investigation different kinds of things. So I'm going to finish just by asking you, do you think this book is any good? How to judge it? And the question I would ask is, does it work? Work for what? Well, the immediate purpose to which I put these ideas for myself is as framing devices for my history of science. So for me, that's the core of what some of us have been calling integrated HPS. But for your purposes, does it work? Is it useful? And I'd be very curious to know about that in the context of your Pushing the Boundaries project, partly because it's life sciences rather than the physical sciences that I know and love, and partly because you come from a different sort of philosophical approach. So what I've said somewhere in the book is my hope is not so much that this book and the ideas it contains will become this locus of excited philosophical debates. No, I'm not that interested in that. I would like it to be a useful book, and the best compliment I can expect from anyone would be that they have used these ideas and found them useful for what they're trying to do. So I'll finish there. That's more than enough, I think, as an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasok. I would ask the panel to switch on their screens. And you've completely sabotaged us already with this galvanizing introduction in two ways. And that is, you're asking us questions. We didn't count on that. And the other is you preempted a bunch of questions we actually wanted to ask you.
That's
anyway.
good.
So that's a good start. So instead of asking you a question, I'm just going to start with 2 or 3 sentences about of answers to some of your questions. Well, the first one was easy. Is the aim of the book clear after reading it? Yes. So that's not a problem. And we found it useful for 2 reasons. First, philosophical reason, where we had 2 approaches floating around our work. One is the view of models as tools in biology, which is very pragmatist and was, of course, developed by Tarja and Andrea. And on the other hand, a sort of a very Wimsatian view of biology, which I bring from my background. And we always thought they would go together and wanted to bring them together. So one of the reasons we have you here and we want to ask you questions is that I think your book brings together pragmatist and perspectival approaches. And the reason that's important for us is so what we're fighting in biology right now is an ultra mechanistic view of living systems, and it manifests itself mainly in this pervasive computationalism that we have, computational metaphors, and a lot of people not just thinking that the brain is a computer, but that everything is computation and evolution is a computational process and blah, 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 blah. So this is a manifestation of a very old view of Laplace and his demon in a new disguise in our view. And we think it's extremely important to educate biologists about new ideas in philosophy that are relevant to overthrow this view of how biological research is connecting to biological reality. And your book came in as a really interesting new perspective. And why would we be interested in that is very easy to answer. First of all, I completely agree with what you said, that philosophy should be useful to not just philosophers, but scientists. And the second is, and I say that as a biologist, we need useful philosophy of science to do new biology. I think we're a bit stuck conceptually. We still have a lot of data to collect and we'll never run out of that. But some of the big questions in biology clearly have been lost. And I think this kind of philosophy that you are promoting in your book is useful as you want it to be for this kind of required change. So I think that also answers your third question at the beginning. Is a lot of the philosophy of science useful to biologists? And it's not, because there are 2 kinds of philosophy of science that are not useful. One is this very abstract analytical science that is just worrying endlessly about definitions of concepts. And the other is this kind of science that is only descriptive of scientific practice. And without naming names, but I'll name a discipline. When I came into philosophy and was starting to read all the neo-mechanist stuff, as a biologist, I was incredibly puzzled by why philosophers were so interested in this completely obvious thing that I was using in my work for the last 20 years. So there was a disconnect. And now I have published in philosophy, and over the last few years intensively worked with philosophical methods to do biology. And so just like you, I share this interest in philosophical methods that are useful as tools. And so that's why we have you here. And before I hold a whole nother speech, I want to open the discussion here. And I want to ask the panel, we have a whole list of questions. Who wants to go first with the first question?
I'm happy to start, and I want to say that I think it's really beautiful that that you really enact in some sense what your book is trying, and that you start out by asking or that you end up with asking the question, is it actually useful, and then getting the feedback or really asking the question, which is I've just found very beautiful and speaks very much to you and the book as a whole and its endeavor in some sense. And your first question also, the aim also seems very clear, and I think you, as you said, you start to tackle many of these problems, or problems is maybe the wrong term, but many of these ideas you play around with. And what I would find interesting, or maybe also for this discussion as a kickoff, relevant, is in some sense some form of contextualization, because you come and are in a pragmatist tradition. You use concepts that are closely aligned to other pragmatist words. You often give them your own tilt and your own definitions and your own perspectives, but then they resonate strongly with other related concepts. And so my question is kind of twofold, both in terms of history, and then people I was reminded often when reading, or that's also my background, but Peirce, for example, was one of the thinkers I was often reminded. So earlier pragmatists, but then also, as Yogi said, Wimsatt was one of the people that we were reminded of very often. And in maybe the Wimsattian corner, the question was, of course, Wimsatt has his concept of robustness, which from our perspective shared many similarities to your operational coherence. And I was interested in your view in how you came up with that, how that was influenced by other concepts, and yes, how the contextual components in some sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much for all of those comments from both you and Johannes. One regret I have, well, one of many, is that I've never managed to really study Bill Wimsatt's work, and I already apologized for not studying his work in my previous book, and 10 years later I'm still apologizing, so I am sorry. But so you can tell me the Wimsattian side of the story. One thing to stress about operational coherence is, well, the contextuality of the concept, if you want, because operational coherence can only be judged with respect to specific aims, right? And something like robustness, I think, at least tries to get away from context, in the sense that if something is robust, it's just robust. But maybe Wimsatt doesn't have that kind of decontextualized idea of robustness. Something I know I do set myself against is the usual kind of reliabilism, right? Which always boils things down to truth in the end, right? What is a reliable process? Well, it is one that tends to give the true answers, and then you just don't get away from the old-fashioned correspondence view of knowledge in the end, in my view. So I'm trying to get away from correspondence, and when you take away the notion that, knowledge is a system of belief or a theory or whatever is good if it corresponds to this inaccessible kind of reality. Once you remove yourself from that, what is your anchor to reality? So that's why I ended up coming up with something like operational coherence. Now, there is a kind of robustness embedded in that notion, because how do I define operational coherence? So one decision I had to make was not to go to success, right? So some people have asked me, why don't you say that truth and reality should be tied to the success of our activities? And the thing I try to explain in the book is that operational coherence is about the design of the activity, not about whether it's every single time successful, right? So operational coherence can be only some of the time successful, but not guaranteed to bring you success. So in that sense, I think there's something akin to the idea of robustness, right? Because robustness is also not about fail-safe guarantee of getting somewhere or delivering a certain result, but it's more like a tendency, right? The difference, I think, is that with operational coherence, I define it in the briefest way as aim-oriented coordination. So it's about what we do in designing our activities. In another sense, it's about doing what makes sense to do given our aims. So then it introduces a sort of a hermeneutic element. So then it's too subjective for some people's taste, but I think it is right that we don't try to take ourselves out of what operational coherence means. And now I'm starting to deviate from your question too far, so I'll stop.
I was just wondering, as a very quick follow-up, how does that avoid, so you're not just trying to avoid the sort of decontextualized idea of truth, which is, I think, what Michela Massimi in her book is going towards, where she says you can get a non-perspectival truth from different perspectives by comparing them. And I think that's a problematic notion. I don't think Wimsatt has that notion.
Right.
There it's also about design, as you say. And that's very interesting. How is that avoiding this, the criticism of circularity here, though? It's like it's whatever in the end, instead of saying what works is truth, you're saying what is coherent is truth, but what is truth is coherence. Is there, how do you get out of that? And I've read the book, I know how you get out of it, but I want you to comment on that quickly.
Well, I'm going to try to give a different answer from what you may have found in the book. So, I mean, what I do want to avoid is the total vacuous circularity of what is often called the coherence theory of truth, right? Which is only about the relationship between propositions, whether they are logically consistent with each other or in some other logical sense support each other. And then that's just completely disconnected from anything that we would consider external reality, if you want to use that phrase. So that kind of circularity I want to avoid, and the way I do it is by insisting on the fact that operational coherence is not something we can achieve just by our own act and thinking, right? Our activities have to work out, and that's not entirely up to us, although we design it in the best way we can. But there's another way in which, no, I don't think we can avoid circularity altogether in another sense, which is that in the end, our system of ideas is going to be circular. And that's not a bad thing. So it's like picking up your dictionary. Your dictionary is a massive net of circularities, right? Any word is defined in terms of a bunch of other words, each of which is defined in terms of other words. It's a huge circular net. And that's not a bad thing, because that's the only way it can be, right? So philosophical notions like truth, coherence, reality, the whole bunch of them that I have, they can only be circular in that dictionary sense, right? But it doesn't mean that what they try to designate is circular in a pernicious way. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. I think, Andrea, you had a bunch of questions about these concepts of reality, truth, and so on. Do you want to go ahead with those?
So maybe let me start with, you know, one notion, this operational coherence was something, because as Johannes already mentioned, Tarja and I are working on models and are especially also interested in model construction. This means in the actual practice of doing it, to get up to the models and use the models as tools in answering questions. And so this operational coherence for itself, it sounds very nice for me, but it's not as smooth as you may first think, or as it suggests. So you mentioned, and I really love Pickering in your book, and you say there's all this resistance scientists are facing in this period when they are really trying to set up the experiment or trying to construct their models. So I guess there's this notion is really, for me, it's a crucial notion, but has so much deepness when it's in the practice itself. So that sometimes I think it's really a challenge to bring this out and to also to get some more general points about it, because when we want to talk to a scientist, then we have to we don't have to teach them the practice, but we have to come to these more broader conclusions. And you know, talking with them here, I'm at Caltech at the moment, so they're very much aware of all this, and they are also very much aware of, or not, you know, it's this practice still relates to truth, to an objective truth. They want to get to an objective truth. And I really found this your notion of truth, it's very, for me, it's very hard to convince them that we have to think different. You know, when you do this kind of practice, the truth you get is the truth in the system you are working in, and it's defined by the concepts you are working in with, and the concepts which are, you may even change over time, or you may use, you know, go from the computational concept, you go more to a kind of thinking in more broader terms about organizational principles and all these kind of things. So I'm wondering, you know, how to, you know, this form of reality, what is related to it, which is not objective. So how to convince the scientist about it, that this is a kind of what they're getting out of what they're doing there, and giving up on this idea of objective realism and truth. And I mean, a lot hinges on what we mean by objective, which we can go into again. But the questions you raise in relation to the practicing scientist are, I mean, those worry me a lot, and it's something I think about. So, you know, one thing I don't pretend to do is to tell scientists how science works. And I think they know very well what they're doing, but I will say this, I don't think they're always
consistent about what it is when they try to articulate what it is they're doing. I think there are these two really different sides, at least to the physicist. And you're sitting there at Caltech, Andrea, and that gives me a memory. So indulge me for a couple of minutes. So I was an undergraduate student at Caltech. I had gone there so that I could grow up to be a Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist, all that stuff. And I went in having read lots of popular science books with this grand notion that I'm going to find the truth about the universe. When I got to Caltech and went through what is now in retrospect, what I recognize as Kuhnian normal science education, it was really disappointing, right? Because whenever I want to talk about the grand truth of the universe, my professors would tell me, just stop that. That's a philosophical question. Just do your problem sets, right? And then, okay, I do my problem sets. And how do I solve this really difficult problem? And some clever classmate of mine would show me how it's done. And I said, but why do you do it like that? It doesn't follow from first principles. And the invariable answer to that is, it works. Physicists love that phrase, right? It works. That's why we do it. So I think there are two sides to your typical physicist. I don't know about biologist. One side of it loves what works, right? And I think they can very much relate to operational coherence, and that's in the end who wins the game. Can you make it work, whether it be the particle accelerator or the codes you write for the data analysis or the tricky integral that you make to make converge or whatever. And I think their day-to-day sense of objective truth has a lot to do with that. But then there's the lip service they pay to, oh, the objective truth we want to get. But I don't think that really connects very much with their practice. So there I have some doubts about taking everything they say at face value. And I mean, just as a quick comparison, when I talk to chemists, when I look at their practice, it doesn't really look like they're reductionist, right? They've got their own methods and their own problems, and they're not just applying physics, fundamental physics to molecules. But then when you get them at the cafe and talk to them about the nature of their enterprise, they say, oh no, it's really just all quantum mechanics that we try to cope with in different ways. So I think that there's that kind of disjointedness that we see in science. And I would submit that the clear majority of their actual practice is along the grain of operational coherence rather than this correspondence type objective to it. Sorry, that was a bit long, but you did give me a memory about struggling with the scientist.
Yeah, but I think you captured it very nicely, because this is what I also see. So when you really look to what they're doing, then it is very much in this sense of what you described as operational coherence, but it's the next step, of putting it in this broader picture, and saying, okay, what you discover here or what you get, it's not truth by itself, but it's a truth which comes from how you do what you do in your lab.
Yeah, and I think that's one really useful things that the pragmatists, the classical pragmatists, James and Dewey especially, I think, also Peirce, but I think Peirce was a bit ambivalent about this. The pragmatists showed us very clearly that the kind of truth that we actually care about in our activities is not about somehow gaining access to the inaccessible reality. So that's one thing I found quite inspiring in pragmatism. And
Yeah.
I mean, the more modern pragmatists also have that sort of trope, right? Rorty, for example, saying, what do we mean by the love of truth? We mean all kinds of different things that we sweep under that one notion.
Maybe not just one quick thing. So this is what you also have in your the accessibility of the object or the accessibility of the phenomena. This is what counts, what kind of methods, concepts you have available to make them accessible.
Yeah.
This defines the practice, and it's not, these grand truths out there.
Yeah. And what I want to say is not that nature is inaccessible, but that nature is accessible, but that nature is already conceptualized nature, right? Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So before we get to Kevin's question, I just wanted to sort of paraphrase that back at you to see if we get this right. So this is not, I think Ron Geary calls it silly relativism.
Right.
This kind of relativism that's completely self-referential and says everything is just a language game or a power game, but it's an embedded, coherent activity, and that's very important, is embedded in a reality that's beyond our control. So this distinction I really liked in your book. This is one of the most useful things I got out. This very clear phrasing of the fact that most of reality is not controlled by our mind, but every little bit of reality that we can deal with is mind framed. Because otherwise we're dealing with noumena and not with phenomena, and noumena don't exist, basically. They don't, that's a non-concept. Everything is phenomena. Everything comes out of the personal experience of someone somewhere, right?
I have to admit, I felt in the course of writing this book, I felt much better after I articulated the mind framing and mind control distinction. Because always you run into this notion, but we don't want to lose mind independence. Okay, well, what do we mean by mind independence? And what we don't want to lose is the idea that, no, we don't, of course, we don't control what happens.
So it's not arbitrary, it's contextualized.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. And I mean, speaking of relativism, the man who educated me most about relativism is, of course, your Viennese colleague, Martin Kusch. I mean, I don't pretend to have studied all of his work on relativism, but he told me one very basic thing, which is, look, what is relativism? Relativism is not the opposite of realism or even objectivism. Relativism is the opposite of absolutism. It's the denial that there are any absolutes, and especially when it comes to the criteria of judgment. So in that sense, right, I think every reasonable person is a relativist. Unless, right, we want to go back to an absolute God, or absolute logic is people's favorite fallback. But I mean, if we talk to any real logicians, they'll be the first ones to admit there isn't just one system of logic. So what can we have that is absolute? And there is nothing. That's the lesson I've taken from Martin's Relativism 101.
If you want absolute knowledge, then join a cult.
Yes.
Kevin, you had a question.
Yeah, already tons of questions, but maybe it's better to substitute them for the more prominent follow-up on relativism. And I'm curious to hear what you would say when I would claim now that maybe the even more exciting and maybe from physics and biology stemming idea would be relationalism. Because when we're talking about contexts and this mind framing and this independence of all of that, what's your thoughts on maybe substituting again relativism for something like relationalism.
Yeah, I would be in favor of that, because well, partly for the linguistic reason that relativism has acquired so many unnecessary and negative connotations. So thinking in terms of something like relationalism would be good, I think. And I mean, there are many different things that would come into it. One thing I don't talk enough about in the book is the social aspect, right? That so much epistemic activity is relational in the interpersonal sense. I mean, I do say that's really key, and then I don't go into enough of it. So I'm hoping that someone more capable than myself on that front can pick it up and do something with it. And then there's also the relation between the knower and the known, right? I think that relationship has to be considered in a more philosophically rigorous way than I have been able to do. And then, okay, what about the relationism of things, right? Are objects only defined in relation to each other? I think that has to be true in some sense. But again, right, someone better at metaphysics than I am needs to really dig into that relational dimension. So did you have some specific directions in mind, Kevin, about relationism?
Well, again, tons of that, I guess, stemming maybe from Ernst Mach's idea about this, in contrast maybe to Einstein, but maybe going more into what you just said, if we at least accept sort of a minimum relationalism approach, and the things you said before about reality is not really binary, we neither have it arbitrarily, but on the other hand, also not able to pinpoint it to one state alone. So we could also think about relation in terms of time, I would say. So speaking in terms of aims for the action. So I would like to know your response on if there is a necessary sort of aim already included when we talk about having actions and the purpose-oriented working like action. If it is purpose-oriented from your point of view, I guess this also aligns pretty nicely to at least Yogi's work, but also our work about the relevance realization, and maybe if there is sort of a relevance entropy that you could carve out from what you say about action in order to act in a certain way.
I mean, the last bits of your comments go into very unfamiliar territory for me, so I would ask you perhaps to say more about relevance, entropy, and all that. Yeah, I mean, something I'm not comfortable with, because I've not thought carefully enough about it, is that relation between things with each other. And I mean, in the context of physics, I did worry about things like Percy Bridgman asking, could an object all alone in the universe radiate anything out? And he didn't think so, right? He thought it was always that light or other radiation couldn't exist at all unless there was a sender and receiver. So it comes down to even that kind of question. But then what I'm not quite comfortable with in terms of the philosophy I discuss is where I draw from John Dewey's fundamental idea that the knower is an organism in its environment. And that's the quasi-Darwinian place he's coming from. And there's a kind of perspective that Joe Rouse picks up these days, right? When he talks about the niche construction of practice. And I honestly don't know how to think about that. And maybe you guys can help me about that relation between the knower and the known. But the known is also the knower's environment that partly defines the knower, right? So I have difficulties with that, and also with thinking about the relations of things with each other. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you any useful answers, but I'm just telling you what I'm stuck with.
So one of the central concepts we're looking at is this idea of the relevance realization, how an organism builds a relevance, a salience landscape, maybe, out of a very complex environment. So how do you pick out the relevant features? And you can show that there is no algorithmic solution to that problem because you get into an infinite regressive optimization.
Yeah. So in that context, how is relevance defined?
So relevant is what is beneficial for you as
so
a living,
in terms of
beneficial towards your continued existence.
Okay, right, yes.
And so this can be conditioned by natural selection, but natural selection doesn't really explain how the behavior comes about in the first place. And so there's a more proximate explanation that's needed. And I think that's one of the big blind spots that we have in that knower and known, understanding that knower and known relationship, right?
Yeah. And I don't know, is Marjorie Green helpful at all in that?
So there I have to confess, like you confessed that you haven't read, Wim said, I haven't read Marjorie Green, which is scandalous, and I should, but I have not done that yet.
Yeah.
So I think we have reached the full hour, and I want to slowly open up the discussion to the whole audience. But there's one question that there's a quote. I want to end the panel discussion with this one quote and a question attached to it. So you write in the book, there may be times when a word is so soiled by negative connotations that we should just give it up instead of engaging in futile attempts to correct the misuses and abuses of it. So I would love to know from you, I would get a top 10 list of concepts that need to go.
Yeah. Martin won't like me for saying this, but I think relativism is one of those. Some people have told me, why not put truth on that? Do you really need this concept? And my answer is in the book. I think truth is important and has important functions in everyday life as well as science. I think we need to keep it and save it. This is what the liberal political people realized in 2016 as Trump came on the scene, just with his complete disregard for the truth, shocked everyone back into respecting truth. So I think we need that concept. Kantian noumena, I would probably put on this list. God would be another, because I think it's more distracting than beneficial. So I haven't reached 10, but
it's good enough. Yeah.
Those are fantastic. Few candidates.
Thank you. I would like to thank the panel for the great questions, and
also thank you.
Would like to encourage everyone to switch on their camera now if you want to be present in the discussion. And we have a question in the chat that came pretty early and follows nicely from the panel discussion. We have a few hands up. But the question in the chat was from Martin Wieser, and I'm just going to read it. Regarding operational coherence, how would you define an aim of your activity? And how does it differentiate itself from a drive? And often when you do something, the aim only becomes clear as you do it.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. To address the second part first, yes, absolutely. Well, I said absolutely, I shouldn't. That's a bad expression. The aim does sometimes get clearer as we go. Not only that, the aim also changes as our activity proceeds. And I think that is also quite healthy sometimes, because part of what happens is we learn to adjust our aims depending on what is feasible. So if we keep trying to achieve an aim that turns out to be practically impossible, then that ends up being like someone's definition of insanity, right? Repeating the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So I think, yeah, aims are not fixed, that they do and should evolve. But what exactly is an aim, and yeah, how is it different from drive? Another question that's similar is, how is an aim different from a value? So in my usage, at least, an aim is quite a specific thing, right? A drive would be a more general impulse of particular types, like hunger, right? So the aim at least has to be to acquire food. And quite often it'll be much more specific than that, right? So my aim can be as specific as to get 5 pounds of bacon for dinner. So the aims can be, I mean, they usually are nested, right? And I think that's all fine. There's no problem with that, but it does mean that the picture, the background of operational coherence is quite complicated, because we have to always ask, what, with respect of which aim are we talking about coherence? And then there's also the question of whether the pursuit of a particular aim is a coherent thing to do with respect to other bigger aims that we have. So the picture is complex, but I think that is right. The picture is complex about the practices of life and science, and we shouldn't, in our philosophy, pretend that the picture is simple. So hopefully that's enough as an initial answer to these questions.
Kind of the converse
Martin,
to Occam's razor. You should not. Well, it's always, this quote is attributed to Einstein, but I don't think it's him who said it. That you shouldn't. You should simplify as much as possible, but not more than that. So, so next question was from hands up. Was Clem.
Hi, Clem.
Hello, thank you so much. Yeah, no, this was really great. It was really nice to listen to. For a little bit of context, I am, starting a career practicing as a scientist, but I had Hasok Chang as a teacher when I was a master's student, and this has informed my own perspective on philosophy a huge amount. And yeah, so I found myself in the conversation about talking about objective reality and the absolute, developing a reaction which maybe runs counter to a lot of what was being expressed, but kind of on the same grounds as a lot of your work, which is something like, I think there's actually a function in a kind of belief in the absolute, or belief in objective reality, which I think is very important in the practice of science. And yeah, like when you talk about the scientist who has this like belief in what works in their everyday practice, but then over the coffee we'll talk about some either reductionist or some absolutist notion of truth. I think there's like a function to that kind of coffee discussion as well, which is really important. And it's like, I think there's something like it's been vindicated over time. Like it feels to me like if people had the attitude to absolute truth and relativism that is being espoused by you and your colleagues here, I have this like hesitation that maybe we wouldn't have made the advances in science that we did, because before the fact, a lot of them seemed absurd. Like it seemed absurd that Einstein could come along and find a like more accurate description of reality than Newton's. And I think it kind of almost requires a hardened belief in that you are looking for something true. And so it seems like, and I don't, so I'm where I'm coming from now is I'm in like looking at fields like consciousness science and like science of agency, where it's actually very uncertain as to whether or not there is this notion of the absolute truth. Like there's so many people who believe that actually there's no answer to what does it mean to be conscious, which is satisfactory. And it's not like physics in this respect. And so like there's an actual question here as to like, not is it true or something, but like will the belief in truth prove useful? And it's like very unclear to me what the answer to that is. And it seems to me like an implicit thing that you're saying here is that actually the belief in truth may no longer bear fruit. And the belief in truth might not bear fruit. And that's just something that I'm very hesitant to
accept. Thank you. Thank you. I know, I think I know exactly what you mean. And I have an unorthodox answer to that, which I'll give in just a second, but it also reminds me of what happened with William James a century ago. Some of you may know his infamous essay, The Will to Believe, right? I mean, James got into a lot of trouble from the likes of Russell by arguing that, look, if religious belief truly allows people to live good, effective, satisfying life and flourish, then who are we to say that the God doesn't exist? Or why do we presume that these beliefs are false if they are so useful and effective? And he got into a lot of trouble for that, as you can imagine. So that's in the backdrop. What I would say is that if you look at the history of science, yes, I think there was a time when the likes of Newton, at least up to Einstein, were motivated by this search for the absolute truth, which was monistic, and it was the word of God for Newton, Einstein, something less specific. But this is the unorthodox bit. I think that's what you find in an immature state of science. This may have been psychologically how they needed to get it going, but I don't think it's any longer necessary. And I think if you look around current scientists in very well developed fields like chemistry, biology, you don't really see this anymore. And I think what the later history of science has shown is that exactly the kind of work that Newton and Einstein did can be done without that faith in the absolute truth or the divine design of the universe. So I think that's where we are going. And as a good pragmatist, I have to say, well, time will tell, depending on how science works out. Now, there's a comeback to this spot. If it was necessary for Newton to believe in the divine truth to do his science, then was it true for him? And I don't want to, this is why I don't want to define truth in that extremely subjective personalist way, right? I'm asking, are there coherent epistemic activities, right? So that's not personalized. And if someone else can do it, then yes, there are coherent activities. Yeah. Okay. So let me leave it there and we can come back to that. It's a super important question.
Thanks. We're not going to discuss the use of phlogiston theory here today, but yeah, that's an interesting bit of the book. Moritz was next.
Hi, so thank you very much for this super interesting discussion so far. I really enjoyed it. I have to admit, I just started reading your book, so please excuse me if I like ask a question that you already explained in the book
That's
as
okay.
well. But like something that's coming from this discussion, like first I wanted to say like I liked your little excursus into the physicist way of looking at it, because like I went into quantum physics with also this very strong notion of like I want to figure out what's the mystery behind like the measurement problem, what is the role of the observer in quantum physics. And I was working in quantum foundations for some time, and I also got like the replies from my professors that like my questions are philosophical questions.
Yeah.
And after some time of facing that, like talking to people like Anton Zeilinger and other people who are like very strong in that field, I was like, okay, then I will go to philosophy. I will just take their advice. So
that's
I could
exactly
relate to that.
what happened to me as well.
Yeah, that's very nice to hear that that happens, because it seems to me that this demarcation line that, at least in quantum physics, what I see is very arbitrary. And philosophical problems like Bell's inequality led to a lot of practical applications. So that just strengthened my view that demarcating the philosophical from the scientific questions is kind of an arbitrary process, and that is something that is like in context of scientific practice, that we just decide these questions that we're studying and these are outside of our perspective. So I'm really interested in like the relation of the first person and third person, subjective, objective distinction, and how scientists use these distinctions. And I was wondering, since you talked about the operational coherence, I had two connections that I wanted to ask you about. The first one is the relation to operational closure as it's used in embodied cognitive science by Varela. And the second one was really about the coherence. What is the cognitive role in coherence? Is coherence something that is logical, or is something that is like established by cognitive agents through things like, I don't know, like a consistent worldview as more like an intuitive feeling, or something that can be proven or formalized in any way?
Yeah. Thank you. I have to admit I know nothing about operational closure, so I'll have to ask you to tell everyone, or me at least, what that is. But let me first address your second question. So operational coherence is not just an intuitive sense, but as I was saying earlier, there is a hermeneutic dimension, right? It is about what makes sense, but it's a practical idea of sense making. So it's something that my recent former student, Oscar Westerblad, is working out with his notion of operational understanding and so on. So I say being operational coherence is what we have when our activities make sense, or we are doing what makes sense to do. But then you have to ask, where does that sense come from? Why does doing something make sense? And then it refers, that sense is grounded, or at least tied up with our experience of making things work, right? So it's this inseparable linkage between our intuitions and our actions that we are trying to capture with this notion of a practical kind of coherence, right? So it's not just what makes sense in the abstract, it is what makes sense to do, right? And that's that's a phrase that we use in everyday life, but when you think about it, it's quite a mysterious thing, right? What makes sense to do. Again, that's defined in relation to the aims. What is our experience of trying to achieve our aims? Did we get close by doing it this way? Did changing it in that way over here take us farther away from likelihood of success? You know, that's sort of accumulated experience of action, I think, is what feeds into the sense of plausibility and intuitive harmony and all of that. So it's something I haven't quite cracked, but I think that's what we're looking at.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So just to come back to the operational closure argument, it's by Maturana and Varela, neurobiologists that phrased this end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and tried to formalize what makes a biological cell self-producing. So they kind of like looked at a biological mechanism that could explain like the internal versus external distinction. So the operational closure is basically the mechanism that gives you internal versus external states, but not as something pre-given from like a ontological perspective, but something that a biological organism does.
Interesting.
And, I talked to Oscar about this actually, and we had this discussion that like making of this distinction, what is internal and what is external, can be mapped to what is subjective and objective in like scientific practice. And there were some people like Olivier Sanchez de Oliveira who tried to like put this back in philosophy of science, of like something that the embodied cognition people call participatory sense making. So sense making is not something internal that I just do, but I do it in relation to an environment. Could be a biological or social context.
Yeah. Well, thank you for teaching me about that. I think
if I can throw in one thing, because Tarja posted something in the chat, and I've seen your question, Nate. I will end the discussion on that one. That's very good. But Tarja writes, aren't you giving the mind a too prominent place when you say mind framing? And I think this is closely related to this question about embodiment. That's why I'm throwing it in here.
Yeah. And yes, I mean, you can immediately tell that I'm not a philosopher of mind, because I'm just using mind as this undefined thing. But
we wouldn't have invited you if you were.
To me, the mind is the embodied mind, right? And mind is not a thing that exists by itself. Mind, to me, is like what Bergson is talking about, what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, what Polanyi is talking about. So, yeah, I don't mean to give a prominent place to the Cartesian type of disembodied mind. And I think, yes, meaning does arise from coherent activities. And this is another way in which the kind of grand circularity I was talking about earlier enters the picture. What is the mind? It's not definable except by referring to activities. What is an activity? Well, it's something that the mind engages in. So it does go around like that. And I don't think there is a way to avoid that. And I'd like to think of it as the kind of thing people have called virtuous circularity. But yeah, but you're right, Tarja. It's liable to be misunderstood when I talk about mind. So I should find a way of preventing that. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. Virtuous circularity is maybe like a spiral that doesn't quite end up at the same.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a picture that I used in my temperature book in relation to that notion of epistemic iteration. So I said it's like a helix. It goes up. If you're looking at it from above, it looks like a circle, but it's not. You have to look at it from the side. So you're making progress even though you are treading the same ground again in that flattened out sense. Yeah. Or it could be a spiral that goes wider and wider. That might be a nicer image in some way. Yeah.
All right. The next question was by Joshua.
Hi, Hasok. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Josh.
I'm also beaming in from California, thanks to Andrea. My question is a quick follow-up to Clem's question, which I thought was very well put. So I understood, Hasok, that even in your own experience, scientists are still, even the mature scientists of today, are still doing this kind of paying of lip service to some
many
sort of
of
absolute
them,
notion
not
of reality.
everyone, but yeah,
Right. And I would have thought that that might be something that can be continuous with the history of science, the history of physics, for example, where when you actually look at the practice of the scientists, you can gather one thing from it. And then when you ask them about what they're up to, they say this kind of thing that you're pushing back on in your project. And so I guess my question is just like, what's going on there? It seems like scientists, you might think, are kind of systematically misled about what they're doing in the history, in today, perhaps. And I guess, like, how would you account for that, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say it's a bit like the Marxist notion of false consciousness. But what is the origin of this? I think historically we are still laboring under that European tradition of religious origin of science, right? I mean, yeah. I just saw this morning on the news Francis Collins being interviewed, the Human Genome Project guy who was the NIH director and everything. He's written a book about science and faith. And yeah, he's very clear that we are still living in that tradition of theistic science. And he thinks that makes sense. I mean, I don't think science has to be like that, but European science did inherit that monism that came from monotheistic religion. So I think there's still an influence of that. There's also the effect of pop science, I think, right? Because so many scientists are inspired by reading about Einstein and people like that. And then some of it is psychological, right? Why would you bother doing science unless you're searching for this something grand? But that's, again, going back to my Caltech undergraduate days, what I also found among my fellow students was that actually very few of them were motivated by the search for the truth. Most of my friends were, I mean, many of them were in engineering and applied sciences rather than science, but a lot of the biology people also didn't seem to be that inspired by the grand truth thing. And also the experimental physicists often didn't seem to be. And that to me was disappointing at age 20. Now I look back and say, well, those guys had a point. Why do we have to be driven by the delusions of grandeur in order to do some nice investigations about this bit of nature? So I think it's a combination of the theistic history, the inspiration by popular science, and for some people, the necessary psychological motivation. And I think these are all things that we can get over.
Yeah. So you obviously don't think there's like some important functional role of having that kind of attitude. You think that can be done away with?
I think there is a functional role, but it's like looking at the old cathedrals, right? Medieval cathedrals. I mean, no, they would not have built such things with hundreds of people dying in the process unless they were religious fanatics. But now we know how to build such things, and we don't have to be motivated by dreams of otherworldly salvation, right? So I think we can get over these phases of science, and so something. I mean, this will take us away from the main topics, but something I lament is what we seem to have lost in another kind of motivation for science, which is the curiosity and wonder about the very mundane phenomena, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you might have experience of, let's say, making an electromagnet with your hands for the first time. Wow, that's just amazing, right? Or just even playing with magnets, or looking at a bit of nature that just seems incredible. I think that sort of motivation for science was also always there from the early days. And sometimes, especially we historians and philosophers of physics, tend to downplay that kind of thing. Yeah, but Faraday playing with magnets is something I like to go back to.
Yeah.
We
Thank you.
biologists only got to dissect frogs, so that was
Yes, there is that too.
less inspiring.
Yeah.
Also, in its own way. So I want to be mindful of your time, Hasok, but we have two more.
I'm fine.
Questions.
Let's
Are you okay with that?
Let's take the remaining questions.
So then I would pass the next question on to Dan.
Hey, hello.
Hi,
Thank you
Dan.
to the Vienna team, and hello to Hasok, and thank you for being here. I had several questions. I'll try to lean them down a little bit, or make it a bit more lean. The overarching question I have is, if you would, and if so, how, differentiate between useful and not so useful forms of pluralism. And to give that a bit of context, I was struck by actually what Yogi was saying in his introductory remarks, that one of the upshots of your book is that something is pragmatically good because it's useful. And being a philosopher and therefore being pedantic, I jumped in and took a note, and I said, well, I think the specifically pragmatic insight that you're trying to tap into is that an idea is useful first and foremost because it does something. Not because it's useful, because then it runs into the rejoinder, useful for whom? And specifically there, I see a possible danger in the kind of, I think that, an expression of lip service was used in an earlier comment, but if lip service is used to say that, we're all pluralists and we should all be happy with being pluralists, then that strikes me as possibly counterproductive, because nothing ever happens if people continuously terminate in the observation that, oh, there are many aims, oh, there are many ways to get at this aim. So how would you differentiate between pluralism? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So I think the not so useful kind of pluralism is one in which people don't care. Right. It's the kind of relativism which says whatever, right? It's all the same to me. I don't care which way you go. So that's not useful, I think, because it's not latched on to any aims, right? The useful kind of pluralism starts with society in which people have different aims, right? And then they will try to achieve those aims. And then at another level, even if you have the same aim, you have different views about how to achieve those aims. So you split along those lines. And that, I think, is useful, right? Because, the first step is the democratic principle. People have different aims in life. We should allow them to have different aims that will help them flourish in their lives. The second step is the more like the hedging the bet kind of pluralism, right? We all agree we want to get to the same, but different people have different ideas about what will get us there. So I think those are both useful kinds of pluralism. The not so useful kind is when people don't care, or, right, if pluralism is not managed well, and it just, you end up with just fights, right? And that's the old criticism of philosophy, right? That's the Kuhnian disdain for the pre-Socratics that Popper admired so much, what they do, they just argued, right? Argued and argued because they didn't have useful aims other than being right. Now, I don't think that was true of the pre-Socratics, but that's the critical view, right? So I think not so useful pluralism is either not caring or a destructive engagement. But I not said anything you don't already know.
Yeah, that's true. Yogi and I have a long standing discussion about what we call group hug pluralism. And how
group hug pluralism.
Yes,
group hug.
Oh,
Yeah.
group hug, right?
Yeah. And Richard Bernstein called it flabby versus engaged pluralism, which
flabby, right? Yeah. No, group hug itself is not even pluralism. It's just not doing anything with the differences that you have. So yeah.
Perfect. Great. Okay, so we have Hasok, we have one more question in the chat that I don't want to skip, and that's Nate Gailing. So how could we make this the dominant narrative about science? It's a minority position right now. What is your grand plan? Please reveal that to us.
No, I don't have a grand plan, and I'm not sure that there could be one, but I mean, two things I'll say. And I'll try to be brief, or we could talk about this forever. One is just showing by doing the usefulness of this approach, right? And I think that is partly working. I mean, the fact that there are all of you sitting around talking about this, giving your valuable time, is something, and I hope that means you have found these ideas useful. I mean, I'm really hoping to reach historians of science more with this, that this is a kind of philosophy of science that you don't have to hate or consider irrelevant. This can actually help you. And I think hopefully the same with the sociologists, anthropologists of science, anyone else who deals with science, I hope will find these ideas useful, but this can only be done piece by piece. So that's one aspect. And it's perhaps not a systematic approach, as Nate questions at the end. The other thing I think we can do, and this is a more grand plan kind of idea, is to get at science education and education more generally, because I mean, where the kind of picture that I'm trying to work against is most strongly reinforced is in the realm of education, right? Students just being told from age 5 or whatever, water is H2O, end of story, go from there, right? The earth is round, there was a big bang. I mean, we learn these things in the same way as people would have learned from a young age about the Bible and everything else. So can we engage more effectively with people who provide education for the next generation? And one thing I feel very sorry about in the history of philosophy is how philosophy in general has become so disengaged from education. And I mean, think back to John Dewey. Dewey is still remembered very clearly in the education field, right? In philosophy department, who's reading Dewey? In education, they still all know about Dewey, at least in the USA. So he had an enormous influence about the education of young people. Why have we just given that up in philosophy? And more narrowly within philosophy of science, why are we not engaging more with people in science education? And I find that people in that field are very eager to engage with us, but we're ignoring them. So this is probably where I will be going next with my as my main focus once that undone book is off my desk. So yes, thank you, Nate. So yeah, it's piecemeal showing by doing and then getting at education.
Fantastic. I totally, absolutely agree with you on this. And I won't mention that I offer philosophy courses for scientists here, although they're really popular among the students. The problem is to get them, the department heads and those people who have to organize those, convinced that they need it. But I have, from years of experience, I can tell you that there's at least a minority of science students who are really, really in need, actually, of this kind of education, this kind of conversation that we have today, and really want to hear that as well. Not everybody by far, but a lot of people are questioning what they're doing nowadays. And I think this is also a chance for us to, you know, a crisis is always a chance to actually make a change. I think it increases the possibility that we can actually have an impact, and education is massively important here. Thank you so much, Hasok.
Thank you.
I think we should definitely finish here. We've gone over time already, which was to be expected with such an interesting topic. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. I don't know if we answered any of your questions.
Yes,
you can be assured that your work is useful to us. One thing, again, this mind framing, mind dependent distinction is just useful to me personally in my thinking, because I was trying to explain the same point in very complicated ways. And now you gave me the words that I need to explain to people how that.
Well, then my work is done.
Yes. So thank you not only for that, but we've all, and I should say that again, greatly enjoyed your book and do find it useful. And thanks for everybody who dialed in as a guest here. And we'll be back next week, same time, same day, to talk to Dan Brooks about levels of organization. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.